Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
So let me ask you this question if you're listening. Do you have a hard time loving yourself? Are there moments in your life, I mean, I think I've had this, where I've almost been at war with myself at times, right? I almost hate myself, my behavior, my mistakes, my past self, my ineptitude, my lack of capacity. Like sometimes I'm really hard on me. In fact, I would say I'm probably harder on me. You may not agree, Antonia. Maybe my children wouldn't agree, but it does feel, at least from inside of myself, that I'm really hard on myself. And I think that I'm not alone. I think a lot of people have a critical voice, self-criticism, harshness. They don't have a lot of empathy for themselves. We hold ourselves to these standards we would never hold anybody else to. And so you might be a person right now listening along and you genuinely struggle with falling in love with who you are. And I think that we've got an incredible tool, which is personality type. And if we go layers deeper than just the 4-letter code in Myers-Briggs and we go deeper into what's called the cognitive functions, our view, Antonia, and we're going to talk about that today, is that you actually have an access point for falling in love with yourself. There's an opportunity to understand ourselves better, to understand how we're learning information, how we're making decisions, and also apply some of the ways that we fall in love with other people or fall in like with other people, whether it's friendship or romance. I mean, we give other people the benefit of the doubt we wouldn't give ourselves. We're kinder to other people sometimes more than ourselves. So if you're a person that struggles with self-love or accepting who you are or loving who you are, I think that this is going to be a really interesting podcast to lay out some framework using your personality type as an access point for that. And so we could really say falling in love with your personality type, who you are. Your personality type isn't who you are, but it illustrates and demonstrates so much about you, right? It's the wiring of your mind, and it gives us a lot of access points for self. I think this conversation will be very helpful for someone that struggles with the self-love issue.
Yeah, I think I'm going to say something that directly contradicts maybe even entire podcast episodes that we've recorded in the past. And it's going to sound like it contradicts it.
Just go erase all those episodes, whatever they are.
Yeah. I don't remember what they are,
Edit
but quick.
them. They don't all count.
It actually doesn't contradict. It's adding a little bit of a distinction.
Yeah.
But we recorded entire podcast episodes on how personality type is who you're not, right? Like you are not your personality type. We've said that many times in the podcast. You're more than that.
We even talked about it being a problem just recently in the last, I can't remember, just a few episodes ago.
Right. Well, we were talking about how Carl Jung he thought our personalities were a problem, right? In the book Psychological Types, Dario pointed it out to me, or Dr. Dario Nardi. Dario pointed out that 5 of the chapter headings have the word problem in it. the problem of. Yeah. And so we've tried to really communicate this idea and in the spirit of don't get too attached to your personality type, don't over-identify with it. And so we've said things like personality is who you're not. But at the same time, that's just to convey the idea of not getting too wrapped up in the concept of being a specific type, because it's never going to give you, you're a totally unique version or iteration of humanness, right? There's nobody like you that has ever existed before, and there's nobody that is going to exist like you ever again after you die. So you're this one iteration. You're the only expression of humanness that is just like you that will ever exist. So don't oversimplify it, right? Don't turn that extraordinary complexity of being into like a single tag of, say, ENTP preferences or whatever, or ISFP preferences. Try not to do that. And so when we talk about personalities who you're not, that's really the idea we're trying to convey.
We don't want you to tokenize your personality. Right. So where it's just the component parts, you're a whole self, you're your whole self. And if you think of it as a tokenization of information or personality, it loses the spirit of what it's for.
Right. Exactly.
Right.
So don't be too reductionist on identity. But at the same time, the thing that sounds like a contradiction is, but it's part of who you are, right? It's not entirely who you're not. It's just not a complete picture of who you are. And so to fall in love with one's personality type is a really lovely on-ramp and access point to falling in love with ourselves, because our type is a little bit of ourselves. right? At least I always see it as the operating system.
Yeah.
I see it as the part of us that all the other information that we bring in gets filtered through, like you mentioned, those cognitive functions that live underneath the best fit type preferences. Those cognitive functions for each personality type are their own special cocktail. And they don't dictate everything, but they certainly inform a bunch of stuff. They inform the things that we're going to be naturally paying attention to. They inform the things that we are going to have the highest amount of certainty and uncertainty around. So there is a lot about type that is, that can tell us about ourselves. So if we can find a way to fall in love with our personality type, it won't help us fall in love with ourselves as an individual completely, or at least it won't. It's not a one-to-one, but it will definitely help us understand that we are beautifully made, right? Our personalities have these really lovely substrates underneath them that can help us appreciate all the other aspects that have been laid on top of the substrate, right? The substrate of cognition. So, like you mentioned, helping us see each personality type, particularly our own, as something beautiful. Well, especially if we're in a downward spiral, which, as you mentioned, so many people often are in a downward spiral of self-loving, right? Then it gives us a little bit of hope. It might turn the trajectory around and go the opposite direction. And as you mentioned, there are principles about the concept of falling in love just in and of itself that I think really help us understand how we can develop that sort of relationship with ourselves. And as you mentioned, it's way easier to dislike and even hate ourselves than it seems to be to love ourselves.
Yeah. And also the frame I'm coming from, we talk about romantic love, let's say, it's easy to think of romantic love like a movie, get swept off your feet, flowers, romance, The Bachelor on, television, like these kinds of,
that's real love. These
ideas of romance and the excitement of the pursuit and the connection point, and then they lived happily ever after, ... And I read this comment, I don't know if it was on X or one of the other social platforms, but somebody was talking about how that's not really a marker of lasting romantic love. You ask an older couple who's been together for 40, 50 years. Yes, they have to have romance and some excitement, romantic excitement in their relationship, but they talk about things like, oh, that time, with a sick kid, or your parent had cancer, or you lost your job and we had to struggle through, or I put you through college, like the tough times and doing life together, and then figuring out how to navigate through that, and then finding love on the other side of it too. That's deep, lasting romantic love. Mm-hmm. Not just the flowers and romance, but true partnership love.
Yeah.
And I think the same thing applies to the self. Mm-hmm. I was born with people that I will not die with. Mm-hmm. I'm alone in my life. The people I was born around at the time of my birth are going to be very different than the people I'll die next to at the end of my life. I'm the only constant in that. You weren't there at the beginning of my life. I'll probably die near you. Hopefully, if we die together or close or something like that, we'll die around each other or close in proximity in years. But you weren't there at the beginning. You didn't see the whole beginning of my story. And maybe my brother would be somebody close, but he wasn't there either. I'm older than him, so he wasn't there at the beginning either. So I think that's important to think. We're the only travel companion we have to this life. We're going to die someday, and we're the only constant we have. It's almost like malpractice, life malpractice, not to love myself, not to find a way, not the chemical love, that kind of romantic, but the true deep value love with myself, to watch myself overcome things at the other end, still love myself in spite of it. Oh man, I made a mistake there. We got through it together, Joel, that kind of narrative. So that's the framework I'm also coming from.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, no, I think that's a great way of putting it. We're the only travel buddy we have through life that's there at the beginning and at the end.
Yeah.
Right. We're our one constant. And the idea that it's life malpractice to not discover a way. I mean, if you were forced to be with somebody your entire life, you're just literally forced to be with them. How much how masochistic is it, right? To decide that you're just not going to like or love that person. Like eventually you'd be able to find the good parts. You'd eventually be able to see the good things coming out. And a relationship to ourselves, I think is, it is a hard one to find true appreciation for. And yet when we do, I actually think that we have a lot more space available to love other people more fully.
Yeah.
We have a lot more space to appreciate the positive, good things about life because we managed to find the good and positive things in the person that we feel the most weight around ourselves, right? Like it's real high stakes. Our relationship to ourselves feels real high stakes.
Yeah.
And even when we're beating ourselves up, in some ways that's actually a form of self-love, weirdly enough, because we have such high standards for ourselves. Like who do you have really high standards for? Usually the people closest to you.
Yeah.
And we're the closest to ourselves. So we have these super high standards and we'll beat ourselves up because we didn't maintain these super high standards. But it's kind of an abusive relationship too, right? It's like, I have super high standards for you because I love you the most. But at the same time, if you disappoint me, I'm going to spend X number of time beating you up because you didn't manage to hit this super high standard I have because I love you so much. It's like a really weird, sort of loop we find ourselves in. But I think if we can use a tool like personality type, which is 1 degree of separation removed from us, right? It is us, but it's also not us. It's the underpinning of our understanding about our cognition, but at the same time, it's just a model. So it's like 1 degree of separation where the stakes are a little lower. And we know that we're not the only one of that type. We know that there's a bunch of other people out there that share that type. So it can also be not just about us. It can be about us and everybody else who shares it.
Yeah.
So I think it helps lower the stakes a little bit, which is why I believe it's a good on-ramp. It helps it so that if we fall in love with the type, well, we're not being, we're not being arrogant, or we're not being, what's the word when you're, you think you're better than everybody else. Anyway, we're not doing that. We are just falling in love with the type.
Conceited, maybe is the word.
Thank you.
You're looking for?
Yes, thank you. We're not just being conceited.
Yeah.
Right? And so that safety of having like 1 degree of separation makes it so that if we appreciate and fall in love with our personality type, now we can take a little bit of that and integrate it into the self and maybe stop beating ourselves up so much.
Yeah.
Maybe be a little nicer to this travel buddy.
So what I hear you saying is personality type can be this amazing 1 degree of separation framework to look at the self, to go, actually, as me, I have ENFP preferences. I'm pretty awesome. I've got ENFP preferences. I'm pretty cool. Look at all the cool things that my mind does. Look at how my personality is wired. Okay, I've got some language and some ways to see things about myself through this lens. And I can see some of the weaknesses I have, some of the challenges I've got, all that. And at the same time, I struggle with this as an ENFP. I want to be the most unique, special snowflake on the planet. And there's only one of a kind of me. And no one else could possibly be anywhere close to my, individuality. Very classical ENFP kind of thing often. And it also helps me with that too. Because it's like, well, there's a pattern to who you are. There's a lot of other people they're not exactly like you. Yes, you are 100% unique, Joel. And also there are a lot of people that are wired very similar to you. So don't get too big for your britches. Don't think you're too, outside of the realm of normal humanness. You're not superhuman. You're not a god among people, right? You've got challenges and blessings and cool stuff and hardships, whatever it is. It almost gives us a sense of modesty for who we are. Right? It gives us a framework so we don't beat ourselves up too much, but also it says, look, there's patterns to this. You're not this amazing, one of a kind genius or anything. There's other people very similar.
Yeah.
So it's humbling and empowering.
Even if you are one of a kind genius, you're still like a bunch of other people who are one of a kind genius.
Sure.
Right? Yeah. So let's start by talking about those principles that will steal from the idea of falling in love with another person. And then there's a little bit of an algorithm here that I think applies specifically to type and our relationship to our cognitive functions that I think help us to build that kind of authentic, real, honest, loving relationship with the self.
Okay.
And then we can do a little bit of that algorithm. So the first thing we'll talk about is fall in love with your personality type in the same way that you fall in love with another individual. It's really fall in love with yourself this way. But again, we're using personality type as like 1 degree of separation to make it a little more safe.
Mm-hmm.
So the first thing you have to do when you fall in love with somebody is you have to develop real love that isn't infatuation. And infatuation is that mixture of chemicals that gets dumped into your brain and into your body that make you want to be around a person all the time. It's that part of you that, or it's the experience or phenomena of not being able to see this person as they are, but as the imagination you have about them, the fantasy you have about them, how that makes you feel. And so you're addicted to the feeling of the fantasy you have about the other individual. That's infatuation. Infatuation is that's that beginning point where we have such a draw to another individual that when we discover who they are over time, that draw made it so that it was worth doing that discovery process. So in order to truly fall in love with another person, you have to get through infatuation to real love, not just the fantasy of the individual inside of you. And so the same thing applies with personality type. It is very common for people to read a profile about their personality type. Maybe it's the first time they've ever felt understood, and they maybe have never felt so seen. And now they know they're not a crazy person, or there's like a system that diagnoses why they've been so different from everyone else, or why they haven't matched things in their life.
Yeah.
And it's really easy to become infatuated with a personality type. Right. And it's because there's a fantasy that is now forming inside the mind of this super character, this fantasy of this person. And this is where we get like sort of an oversimplified expression of type as well, is it's really easy to turn each of the 16 types into like a fantasy about a style of person or an archetype. And so in order to get to true authentic love of falling in love with your personality type, you have to get through infatuation, which is, my type is the coolest type and everybody else sucks. And while not everybody goes through that phase, there is a little bit of it, and a little bit of it is okay.
Yeah.
Right? It's what Isabel Briggs-Myers called type patriotism. It's okay to have type patriotism. It's okay to say, I don't think I want to be any other type. And in some ways it's because this is the monster we're familiar with.
Yeah.
Right? Why would you want to be a different type if you've lived your entire life this type?
I think that's a great point, that it can definitely be kind of I'm better than everybody else. I think the other point of infatuation is when you're falling in love with somebody, and this comes out later in the relationship when the honeymoon period, quote unquote, is over and the fight start, the conflict starts. You're like, why did I give that person a pass for that thing? Like when we're first falling in love with somebody, you can't really get offended. You're not that annoyed. Most of us, there are people that are annoyed very early on, but most of us are like, oh, that's just, I love them. And they like smooth things over in a lot of ways at the very early stages that often become problems later on in the relationship. And I think people also, the same infatuation type energy makes it so I'll give myself a pass. Now that I know my type, well, I'm an introvert, so I don't need to ever go out. I mean, that's who I am. I'm wired to stay inside and hang out, and not go out and do things. I know I'm picking on introverts. I know it's like low. That was a low, like a below the belt, a below the belt hit. I'm not actually picking on introverts for that specific thing, but that's just an example of it. I'm trying not to use myself so much because I could bring my own examples. I'm trying to find other examples and they're a little more stereotypical, but that's one of them, right? It's like you are whatever it would be for you. You learn your type and you could be arrogant, like I'm the best type, but it's also like, well, I can't be expected to X, Y, Z because that's not what my type does.
Yeah, I can't be expected to have an orderly house. I'm a perceiver.
Yeah, I can't be bothered to clean up. Like that's not me. I would never
be on time.
Yeah. So that kind of, or I can't be spontaneous. I'm a judger or something like that. Like these excuses for not engaging with life, I think that's a little bit of infatuation energy. Because you're like, I love who I am. This is great. No, I'm not. I'm going to say no to all the things that aren't me. And I'm going to say yes to all the things that are.
Yep.
Maybe even overindulge these and maybe over reject these ones.
Yeah. Well, and you can see this when people won't take advice from anybody that isn't their personality type. Right?
Yeah. We saw that over the years. Mm-hmm. People stopped coming, like certain people were like, well, I can't learn from you.
Yeah. You're not my type.
Like what?
And not well, my
that's
type.
That's insane.
But,
okay.
Yeah, you're not my personality type. So what would I learn from you? And that, I mean, it's understandable that somebody would want an individual that is sympathetic. I can totally appreciate that. But there is a little bit of an infatuation with the type, and only somebody who is my personality type could really understand things. When really we're all just humaning, right? And so there's a limitation on that piece, right? So
arrogance, giving yourself a pass, and then maybe over-identifying with other people of the same type.
Yeah,
are the three things I'm coming up with.
Yeah. So that's the infatuation phase. And it's a completely understandable phase, by the way. It's what happens when we fall in love, or it's the early part of falling in love. And it's a completely understandable phase. But to truly fall in love with one's personality type, which again is the on-ramp to falling in love with the self, to truly fall in love, you have to get past the infatuation and into an acknowledgement that the person you're in a relationship with now has faults. In fact, they have a lot of them. And some of them drive you crazy. But you love the person enough, you're bonded to them enough to, first of all, forgive them for being human, forgive them for being imperfect, accept that there are things about them that come with the entire package, right? Like all the good things that you love also come with all this other stuff that might be obnoxious or irritating, or, you know, like, why can't you be free spirited and awesome and fill my life with energy and fun, but also be on time all the time, right? Like, why can't you have both of those things at the same time? And it's like, well, they can, but it's a heavy lift, right? It's just a heavy lift. Like, why can't you be somebody who keeps my life steady and controlled and on schedule and everything's orderly and at the same time be the life of the party? And it's like, well, they can, but it's a heavy lift to do both of those things. So it's an acknowledgement that the person is a whole package, and all the things that you love about them are also the things that you might find a little annoying. And an acceptance of that isn't turning them into a project, right? Like, you don't immediately projectize an individual because they're so close to the perfect person, but they've just got a couple of things. And if they could just fix these couple of things, then it'll be just perfect. And so then you get on fixing them. When you really love somebody, you recognize that, quote unquote, fixing, that's on them to do for themselves. You're accepting the individual as they are right now, and knowing that they will change and grow as an individual, and accepting that there will be many iterations of them in the future. And if you want them to be a growth-oriented person, then that's something that you have to vet pre-infatuation or during infatuation. You have to go, okay, this person shares my value of personal growth, right? And so then that's part of why you fall in love with them. Or they don't. You love them and they're not a growth-oriented person, but that's part of what you're accepting about them. And so moving into true love means accepting their limitations, accepting who they are, not keeping the fantasy of who they could be and falling in love with that person. They made no promises of who they were going to be in the future because they can't, right? They've only promised who they are now. And maybe they promised to always try to do better, which is about the closest you can get. So a part of falling in love with one's personality type / self is not immediately projectizing oneself, not seeing all of the failings, all of the weaknesses, all the things that come along, all the bad that come with the good, and go, okay, well, then it's my job to perfect myself. It's my job to now get to moving so that I'm almost there. I'm almost perfect. If I could just purify myself, or if I could just be the best version or whatever. Not best version of self, but like the best version of the type. There is some value in the desire to improve and become better, but love is found in the acceptance of the now, right? Not in an expectation of a promise that you cannot actually make. You can't promise really anything into the future, not truly, especially when it comes to who we are. We can only try. So a part of falling in love with one's type and oneself is accepting what is right now.
So as the kids would say, I feel called out.
Yeah.
This is definitely one I am, like the infatuation thing. I mean, I got a little bit of it. If I self-reflect, I definitely turn myself into a project. And again, it's one of those things, like, it is my tough love on the self. That's, get to work, fix this about yourself. You got all these things you want to adjust and be better, be more successful about, correct, etc. I find myself there all the time. And you listening, this might be where you, more than the infatuation side, I bet a lot of people, especially the people that listen to this podcast, will probably report they're here a lot, turning themselves into a project. I got to fix the next thing. I got to work on the next thing. And it can be good. I think there's positive things to that, but that's not what it's all about.
Yeah. Well, it's love doesn't happen later after the grind. Love happens now, and it helps give energy for the project and the grind, right?
Yeah.
Not projectizing the self, but If personal growth is a thing that's interesting to you, if it's one of your values and your interests, then continue to pursue it because that's you. And that's something you love. That's different than projectizing the self and withholding love for the self until you get to a certain level or you get to a certain place. Because unfortunately, what ends up happening is the goalpost keeps getting moved, right? If you create distance between yourself and your ability to accept yourself, you won't find that you're closing gaps. You'll find that the gap stays the same, right? And the expectations or the rules you created for yourself to self-love, that gap can never be closed until you just close it now, right? You just have to go, okay, well, whatever iteration I am now, that's the iteration I'm going to be in love with.
Yeah. Now there is a legitimate, so if you have like the owner's manual for Personality Hacker, well, we have these owner's manuals which walk you through all 16 types, whatever your type is. It walks you through your cognition, something called the car model, shows you how to get in flow state, shows you some of your looping. And if it's bad enough, it get into trauma, looping type things, or you're gripped by some energy. And then we talk about specifically in those owner's manuals about growing your co-pilot or auxiliary cognitive function, the part of your brain. It's like the translator between the best part of you and some of the more challenging parts. And so we also may sound like we're contradicting things we've said in the past around this idea. We're not suggesting that you don't have a project of developing the self or developing your personality. We're just saying, watch for this when you're falling in love. This is like the next stage of that process. We're not saying don't do this, right? Just be really clear on the nuance of what we're actually trying to land here.
Yeah. You're not doing it in order to love yourself. You're doing it because you love yourself.
You got it. There you go.
Yeah. It's not a can that you keep kicking right into the future, the self-love. It's like, just bring love to now.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's always now. So, it's the same thing as another person. It's like, I'll love you when you get a better job. Right.
Some people say that.
I'll love you when you lose 10 pounds. I'll love you when, it's like, or you can just love them now and then also have that love be part of what supports them on their way. Now, there is an element here where it parts, like the principles of loving the self in the same way that you love another person. There is a place where it diverts in parts because we're actually not responsible for the other person in totality. Like they're a free moral agent. While a relationship comes with some expectations and especially a partnership, like a pair bond partnership or a love relationship for life, that should come with some, we make our decisions together and we have conversations about it. And, there's a mutual responsibility to the relationship itself and to the life that's built. At the end of the day, you're not responsible for the other person's behavior.
They always have the right to leave.
Yeah.
Right. Technically. I mean, unless you're something very bad happened, like you should be able to leave that relationship.
Yeah, exactly.
But you can't do that with yourself. You don't have the option to eject. You're stuck with yourself. That's it. That's all you got. Exactly.
So there is a moment where it diverts, and that's the moment, which is complete and total responsibility for the self. So because of that, the kinds of expectations that we place on other people, some of those expectations we place on other people are reasonable, right? Like I have a reasonable standard of acceptable behavior that if you sink underneath that line, now we're going to have a conversation because I do have a right to leave, right? And I don't have to stay in a situation that, doesn't meet a standard of behavior. But then also there's these moments in life where people are in tough spots or it's particularly difficult at work, and love is part of what gets you through those difficult times when the person is not maybe meeting certain standards that you've set. Is it a moment or is it now a change in behavior or change in personality? And if it's just a moment, it's like, that's what we do for each other, right? We kind of lift each other up in times that are really tough. And so you can have a negotiation around that. But at the end of the day, if the behavior is unacceptable and it's now a new standard, well, then you have a right to go. Can't do that with yourself, like you said. And so the expectations that we have for ourselves are also part of how we love ourselves. If we have expectations that are reasonable, just like the reasonable expectations in another relationship, if we have reasonable expectations for ourselves and we don't meet them, it's understandable that we would undermine our own ability to trust and love ourselves, right? Because we're not meeting our own expectations. Now, they need to be reasonable, and that's part of it. Part of self-love is recognizing that perfection is an ego play. The desire to be perfect as an individual is actually an overinflated ego. It's a belief that you can attain it, whereas you recognize that nobody else can. If we don't expect anybody else to be perfect, but we expect ourselves to be perfect, it means that we think that we're superhuman at the end of the day. We're like, oh no, I could be perfect, or I could be close to it. That's really our ego wishing and hoping and creating a bit of a fantasy about what is possible for the self. So having or designing reasonable expectations that we need to meet is a part of not just falling in love, but keeping love, right? And in the relationship we talked about before, if a person doesn't meet those standards and they do it temporarily, that's fine. But if they do it now permanently, that's not okay. And then we leave, and maybe we'll always love them to some extent, but we certainly won't have them in our lives anymore. And but they were reasonable expectations. When we do that for the self, we undermine. If that person didn't meet those expectations, they were undermining the relationship. And if we don't meet our own reasonable expectations, we undermine ourselves in our relationship as well, or in our relationship to self. So a part of the reason why I think, that's very binary. Sometimes we hate ourselves or dislike ourselves or struggle with self-love because we have too high of expectations and we did not make sure that they were reasonable. And so we can't meet them. Or we do have reasonable expectations of ourselves and we're just not getting off our butt and meeting them, right? We're just not doing it. And there's a part of us that creates almost like a perpetual cycle of self-disappointment, right? Why couldn't I do that? Why didn't I do that? What's going on? And so meeting reasonable expectations is a very important part of self-love. Not because you're a bad person if you don't, but because we are pre-wired to be disappointed in our inability to do so, right? That's just what's going to happen. We're just going to be disappointed in ourselves. And we can take a little bit of that. We can struggle through, we can find some self-disappointment, or get to the other side of it. But at some point we need to step up. At some point we need to go, no, this is something I really need to be doing, or I should be doing. And here I go. And then when we do that, when we meet our reasonable expectations of ourselves, then we're filled with self-love, right? As long as they were, again, reasonable.
So it would be very valuable now to talk about what those reasonable expectations would be. I mean, I probably have different reasonable expectations as an ENFP than you do as an ENTP. And an INTJ listening right now has different expectations. I don't think I could expect an INFJ or INTJ to be as improvisational as maybe I could expect myself. So I think all of our goals and our expectations will be different based on how we're wired. So let's talk a little about a framework, and then we could also apply it to maybe specific types in future episodes. But let's just talk about a framework now. How can we, in a framework way or building block way, core principle way, think about this?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. And this is where type helps us fall in love with ourselves, because it helps us design reasonable expectations based on how we're pre-wired. So knowing how we are pre-wired, which is our cognition, our cognitive functions, it gives us a sense of, when I beat myself up over and over and over again for doing something that is never going to be in my wheelhouse, I discover I have certain type preferences. And now I can go, why am I beating myself up for that? That's not something I should be beating myself up for. But then when I discover what my type preference is, or my pre-wiring does give me natural talents for, and I find myself kind of, slinking by on some natural charm and talent, but I'm not really optimizing that. I'm not really stewarding those capacities. I might be beating myself up over something that I will never be good at, while at the same time giving myself a pass for things that I should be better at. And that's how we create reasonable expectations of our personality type and ourselves. And type gives us a map for understanding what do I need to be optimizing? Where should my standards be higher? And where should my standards for myself be lower?
Yeah, it's a calibrator, and also it can give us a sense of modesty of the self, right? Where we actually fall in all these things.
Yeah, and a vision for what we could be in the future, like truly, not just a fantasy of it, but like a true, like not an infatuation with where we could be in the future, but a true map of where we can head if we learn to optimize the things that we're naturally good at. So here's a little bit of an algorithm. And as you mentioned, Joel, a person can take out their owner's manual, look at the car model, and follow along, because I'm going to be using the car model to walk through the cognitive functions as an overview. And you also mentioned we could talk about specific types in future episodes. I think we should do that. I think we should take what we're talking about in this episode, the principles and sort of the algorithm we're about to talk about. I don't know if it's an algorithm's the right word, but a little bit of the formula, and then apply it to each specific personality type into the future, because I think it's really important for people to discover how to fall in love with themselves. And it's such a leverage point. It's so important. And we're so discouraged from doing it authentically. We're encouraged to give ourselves platitudes. We're encouraged to pat ourselves on the back for things that we may or may not have earned. But at the same time, if we come up with authentic self-celebration, oftentimes that will create envy in other people, and they will unconsciously dogpile us for it. So we're actually not trained into authentic expressions of self-love very often in society. So I think it's important to give a map for each personality type to do it.
Let's go. Let's go into the framework though.
Okay. So if you've got your 4 cognitive functions, your driver, your co-pilot, your 10-year-old and your 3-year-old, or what's technically called the dominant, auxiliary, tertiary, and inferior. One of the things that we have to do in looking at the 4 functions that we most identify with, but are in a descending order of certainty. So by the time we get to that 4th function, the 3-year-old or the inferior, we're at a place of deep uncertainty. And deep uncertainty means it is the function, or that feeling rather, of uncertainty throws us into analysis paralysis all the time. And we don't like that feeling. We hate the feeling of uncertainty. We hate the feeling of analysis paralysis. We just don't like being there. So we are going to unconsciously and sometimes consciously completely throttle anything that lives in the energy of or the purview of that function, that cognitive function. We just are not going to clock very much time thinking about it, doing it, pursuing things that allow us to use that part of ourselves. We are going to push them away. We're going to avoid them. We're going to skirt around them. And we're going to do it a lot throughout our childhood, our teens, and even well into our 20s and sometimes our 30s. So that means that just like if you weren't put in, you weren't given a football at 3 years old, you weren't put in, on ice skates and given a hockey stick at 3 years old. Like there's a bunch of stuff that you need to do extremely young in order for you to be, like a professional player. In order to be a professional football player for the NFL, you probably had to start playing football pretty young. Right. That's not something that you decide in your 30s. You're like, you know what? I think I'm going to go out for the NFL. Like you probably need to do a long time ago.
Yeah.
Same thing with like hockey playing, right? It's not like, you know what? I really like this hockey thing. I mean, I know I'm in my 50s, but maybe I'll be accepted into a league. It's like, these are things you have to do way, way, way younger in order to be top tier, like top of your game athlete. And most things are like that. If you want to be at the absolute top in the world at something, you got to have started doing it pretty young. So if we spend our whole lives juking and avoiding and hiding from and, like doing everything we can to not be in that function until we're, say, in, midlife, well, we have to have much more reasonable expectations of our ability to do anything in that function. So as 2 ENPs, you and I need to have the reasonable expectation that consistency is just not the name of the game for us. It just isn't.
Yeah. And I think there's an opportunity now for self-love in some of those things I can't change. I think that's really what some of the work maybe at midlife is, seeing those parts of myself. I'm like, man, it's been really hard for me to love all this time, but I have to accept and love that part of me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and a lot of times acceptance comes with grief. So it's not just a matter of recognizing that we're not going to be good at that. It's grieving all of the things that are no longer accessible to us because we're not good at it. Like there's a bunch of stuff that other people who have that function stronger, right, in a place of more certainty, they have access to things we'll never have access to. They have a way of living life and appreciation for things that we'll never be able to appreciate on that level. They have advantages that we'll never have. And we have to grieve that. We have to grieve that we have built-in limitations. And that is one of the best ways to identify. It's not just lowering expectations. It's allowing ourselves to be sad that we just can never experience life in that way. And it's easy to demonize it and go, well, people who live life that way, that's lame and that's stupid. And why would anybody do that? We say that when we're young. When we get older and we start to form an appreciation, man, I can feel the grief. I can feel what it means to not really have very many memories of my past, not really have a sense of history, not really be able to feel at home anywhere, right? Like I have a perpetual sense that I'm not home. I never feel like I'm at home anywhere. I'll live in a place for 10 years and I'll still kind of feel like I'm renting it, even if I own the place.
Yeah.
I never get to feel a true experience of home. Right. And there's something a little heartbreaking about that.
Yeah. And just in case somebody's new and maybe a little uninitiated, you're talking about your personality specifically?
Yes.
And the way your mind is wired.
Right. Because mine, yeah.
This is part of your acceptance and it's mine too, but not everybody has this.
Right. Because
you listening might have something different.
Exactly. Sorry. Thank you for specifying that. As two people with ENP preferences, it means that our 3-year-old cognitive function or our inferior is introverted sensing, or what we call memory, which is a sense of being able to create an experience of safety and an experience of like an understanding of past, an understanding of how we are molded every day. And what I realized recently is the people who have introverted sensing or memory as a strength, it's not like they feel at home immediately anywhere either. It's just they are able to create a sense of home. They do that naturally. They naturally start to nest and create a sense of home. And then when they have to move, it's very destabilizing because now they have to start all over because home takes a little while to create. It takes a little bit to acclimate and get to that sense. I just never get to experience it truly. Not like they do. I can nest and try to create a sense of home and just put all my eggs in one single basket. And on some level, I'll always kind of feel like I'm supposed to be somewhere else. Yeah. So, and there's one for each type. So part of truly falling in love with yourself is going through the acceptance process of grief. Like, I just don't get to have that. Right. And that also means that it stops being a theoretical acceptance and starts being an experiential acceptance. I'm experiencing grief. I'm experiencing acceptance of my limitation, right? And then if I can get to the other side of it, as opposed to like getting frustrated that I have to have this limitation and being upset and or like super working on it and being like, I'm not going to be limited by anything and like really trying super hard to do this thing. That's just thrashing, right? I'm just never going to do it like other people do. It's just not going to happen. And so I can thrash and I can suffer and I can like try to synthesize it or whatever. At the end of the day, if I can get through it though, and just accept and grieve and go, okay, that's part of who I am. That's part of the deal, right? That's the other half of all the positive stuff. Then I can set reasonable expectations so that like when I'm hitting the gym 3 to 5 times a week and I'm doing it with consistency, I practically bust out the champagne, right? That like, I'm like, who's setting up the $20,000 fireworks? Because I made it to the gym 3 times this week and I made it to the gym 3 times last week and I did the week before too. So now we are officially celebrating like it's New Year's Eve. All right. And that's okay. Like that's a reasonable expectation for myself. And then I get to celebrate something that I look around and I'm like, but everybody else is doing it better. It's okay. They have a different set of expectations.
Okay. So accepting the limitations through grief, that's a mechanism for it. And if you're looking at your owner's manual, personality owner's manual, and your car model for your personality type, this would be your 3. You could zoom in on the 3-year-old, technically called the inferior cognitive function for your personality type. And this is an access point to look at maybe like a lens to say, okay, a lot of my insecurities, a lot of my limitations, a lot of things I'm uncertain about tend to be in this area of my personality. So if you're looking at that car model, that 3-year-old, again, that's somewhere you could focus as an access point for this exact work you're talking about.
Yep. And grieve it in the way that it has manifested for you as a limitation. Because sometimes we can dial in something or rather in our 3-year-old function. We can figure some stuff out. And we don't have to grieve those. We can celebrate that we figured some stuff out, but it tends to be very binary. And so I think it's nice to be able to, to just go, okay, I'm just not that person. It's fine, right? I'll do my best. And when I succeed, I will, bust out the Bollingers, but most of the time it's just not going to happen. So on the flip side, part of true self-love, just like setting expectations, is really important. Not having too high of an expectation in an area that's you're just not going to reach it. On the flip side, when you look at your driver function or your dominant function, you should actually have pretty high expectations for yourself, because you're not only celebrating this every day. You're just like the Tiger Woods got a golf club placed in his hand at 3 years old. And that's not coincidental why he's one of the greatest, at this point, I think he's still considered the greatest golfer of all time. Well, that's what happened with our first function in us, right? It was put in our hand at 3 years old. It was like, here, play with this. And we went, okay. And we've been spending our entire lives doing this thing.
So much so that we over-identify. Sometimes this is our ego. Like, we're like, this is who I am, this part of me.
Yep. It's the tool I need to be using for every job. It's the best thing. It's the thing I'm going to put forward. I have a bunch of natural talent in it, and everybody should know how awesome I am because of this part of me. And that's because it's the place of greatest certainty. We don't feel uncertain in this part of us. That's why we bring it everywhere. That's why we're constantly trying to solve problems, even if it's not the right tool for the job, because it is the one thing that is secondhand, right? We're just go, okay, this is what I do. This is who I am. So in this arena, we actually should have very high expectations for ourselves, and not just an expectation that we'll do well. We need to feel like we are stewarding something. We need to have a sense of responsibility over it. Like, it's our job to do it well. It is what we bring to the world. It is our gift, right? Not just a gift to us, but our gift that we bring to others. And if we set our expectations for that function low, and we just dial it in because we have so much natural talent, if we don't build skill in it, we don't optimize it, we don't do everything we can to be really dialed in, something inside of us will feel a little disappointed that we're wasting talent, right? Just like we can see so much potential in another person. Now, you don't fall in love with their potential, but if you fall in love with somebody and see their potential and then watch them manifest it, how much more do you fall in love with that person than if you see them dialing it in, just kind of like using it in situations when, they don't want to work too hard, and you just watch all this talent sitting there, not being capitalized on. It's easy to have it undermine your respect and love for the individual.
Yeah. Now, if you're a little bit deeper into this system and you know a little bit more about the functions and all of that, I'll say that Dr. John Beebe calls these two parts of us, our driver and our 3-year-old, technically called the dominant and inferior. These two cognitive functions, he calls the spine of accessing the self. So this is really about our relationship to ourselves, both of our overconfidence and our insecurity. And so that's why we started here, because this is such a powerful place to start with self-love. Thinking about this, and it's a lot of acceptance and a lot of it's high expectations on one side and acceptance on the other. And so it's like this, it's not really balancing anything. It's more just dialing it in, zooming, like putting it in its proper place, but not really trying to balance, like shoring up all the insecurities of the 3-year-old, make them less uncertain and less insecure, and dampening down the drive or anything. It's not like that. You're probably going to be mostly uncertain and insecure in your 3-year-old inferior process. And you're going to mostly be overconfident in your driver. And that's not really ever going to change. Like, both of those things are going to be there throughout your entire life. Now, your relationship to those things can change, but you're probably going to be uncertain and overconfident in both these areas. And this is the spine of self. So as we move from the spine of self, maybe to the other part of our personality in the car model, we're really going to move over to, and we talk about the co-pilot and the 10-year-old. This is our relationship often to other people in our lives. And this is where we kind of put the energy out of ourselves. Now, this isn't like introversion, extroversion at all. This is like a whole different aspect of how we relate. And this is not the spine of self over on these two channels. So let's talk now about the frameworks. What do we do with these parts of ourselves? The co-pilot, auxiliary, the 10-year-old, tertiary. How do we think about these?
Yeah.
When it comes to self-love or self-personality love, loving my own personality.
Yep. I'm glad you mentioned that. So yeah, that first and fourth function, dominant, inferior, driver, or 3-year-old, axis of relating to ourselves. So that's, I think it's really important to bring that out. I'm glad you did. When you go over to the other side, which is the axis of relating to others, this is where we watch ourselves become, if we do it well, become better at contribution. Now, I did mention that first, the dominant function, the driver function. I did say this is the gift you give to the world, but it's also the gift you give to yourself, right? It's your gift. It's what it's the
water you swim in.
It's the water you swim in. That's right. And so if you are optimizing this part of who you are, you're just going to show up better in general for everybody, but primarily for yourself, right? Because it's part of that axis of relating to self. So you're like, look, I'm awesome. That's why Dr. John Beebe calls it your hero function, or at least he says it's associated with a hero archetype energy, which is when you're here, you just kind of feel like, yeah, this is my world, right? I'm a hero. Like, I don't have to worry about anything. I can just swoop in and, save the day, and it's going to be awesome.
Or we find context where that can be the hero. Mm-hmm. Like, I live in the suburbs right now with a lot of introverted sensing memory energy around me. It's not the context for my extroverted intuition or exploration to be a hero. Like, right. I would never choose it to be heroic, but getting in on stage in an improv environment, well, now I can show up as my hero. So it's not only that we bring it to every context, it's that we seek context where it can come out.
Yeah.
That's really what I think we're doing with it often.
Well, and to rationalize things, because I think what I've done in this suburban area is I've rationalized that we're the cool fun house.
Yeah.
Everybody else's lights are off at like
they're
7
all asleep,
PM.
so they don't notice it. But yeah. If they were awake to notice that we're lively at night and they were awake as well.
That's right.
They would also assume that we're the fun house.
We're totally right. That's what they would think.
We're probably just the noisy house for them at this point.
I try not to be, but yes. All right. So over on the other side, you've got the axis of relating to others. So this is where we see ourselves show up for others.
Yeah. And particularly the co-pilot. I mean, this is a part of us, like I said in the very early part of this episode, that we do a lot of work with clients and our students and other people that get our owner's manuals, things like that, because we do relate to others, but there's also relationship to self here. This is nuanced. Mm-hmm. And because we do it in service of others so much, I think this gives us the opportunity to go, wait, I'm giving love out through this channel, my co-pilot auxiliary function. I have capacity to love myself for this channel too. It's like a huge aha moment for most people.
Right.
And we're like, that unlocks a ton of personal growth in our lives.
Right. Exactly. So Dr. John Beebe, John says or associates the second function, this auxiliary or co-pilot, with parental energy.
Yeah.
And the reason why we tend to use it in contribution is because we instinctively use it in behalf of others. We see areas and opportunities where this function can serve. And as you mentioned, a major aha is that moment where we go, oh, I can serve myself with it too. Right. And that's, our mantra, our entire career has been develop the co-pilot. And really what that means is self-parent with this part that instinctively contributes to other people. Now, this is a place of certainty as well, just like the driver, but it's not as certain. And in part because we're using it, we kind of need a little bit of outer world feedback to know whether or not we're doing this well. So we do feel like it's a strength, but it's not as certain because we're not self-validating with it. We need the world to go, yeah, you did a good job. That was good counsel. That was helpful. Thank you. And as soon as we get that ping back, we go, okay, cool. Right. And it's not, well, you get to the 10-year-old, which is the opposite of the co-pilot, what's called the tertiary. And this is a place of, it's the first place where we run into uncertainty in those cognitive functions. We already talked about the inferior 3-year-old fourth function as deeply uncertain. This part of us isn't as deeply uncertain, the 10-year-old part, but it is uncertain. And so we are dependent upon others' feedback to let us know whether or not we did a good job. And so this also ends up being part of our relationship to other people. John calls it the eternal child energy, because we actually don't know whether or not we're using it well until the outer world validates it. Unlike the co-pilot or the parental part of us, that is pretty sure we were doing the right thing. We're pretty sure we're right. And then when we get positive feedback, that just confirms what we already suspected. Yeah. I was doing a good job. I figured as much. So how do we use this in terms of self-love? Well, I think 2 major ways are powerful. The first one is we like ourselves more when we watch ourselves contribute. to others, right? Because we're social creatures. Just like if you're in a relationship with somebody and you watch them be generous with their time, you watch them be kind to others, you watch them contribute, that would make you love them more. They're a more lovable person because they are a contributor. When we watch ourselves as contributors, we love ourselves more. We respect ourselves. We trust ourselves. We see ourselves as better people because we watched ourselves contribute to others and then get positive feedback. So contribution is a big piece of it. So that's the first thing. But the second thing is because this axis, this polarity, is more about our relationship to other people and it gets outer world feedback, we can iterate it much faster. Both of these functions, they're not quite as, the co-pilot is not quite as certain or used or strong as the driver. And the 10-year-old is not quite as uncertain or repressed or pushed away as the 3-year-old.
So much so that some people can mistake their personality type because they're more in balance with each other. They might see a lot of both of these show up and like, which one is it? Which one's more dominant? Which one's more? I don't know. Yep. And so it creates some confusion for some people.
Yeah. It's in Profile training. We talk about how if you can't figure out whether another person's a thinker or a feeler, it's probably because it's their co-pilot or 10-year-olds, right? And that's right. They're a lot more balanced and all the functions are that way. If it's really hard to figure out a dichotomy, like one of the 4 letters in your Myers-Briggs type, it's probably because it's your co-pilot and 10-year-old and they're way more in sync with each other.
Yeah.
And you watch yourself bring them out more often because you're using them in relationship to the outside world, which we have to communicate and interact with the outside world all the time. So because of that, we have a greater opportunity to iterate on them and balance them out. We can watch ourselves find a really lovely balance between those two parts of ourselves in a way that teaches our driver and 3-year-old or our dominant and inferior that balance between two very different ways of experiencing the world is possible. I think of them as two sides of the same coin. And while one is up, like laying on the table, by definition, the other one is hidden. And when you flip it to the other side, well, now you've got, it's heads or tails, right? If you are on heads, tails you can't access or see tails. When you flip it the other direction, well, now you've got tails and you can't see or access heads. But if you spin the coin and both sides are happening simultaneously in the spin, they almost merge into the same thing, right? They become one thing now. And heads and tails, it's like you can't tell the difference between them not because one is hidden and the other one is seen, but because they're both seen at the same time so quickly. Because our auxiliary tertiary or co-pilot 10-year-old is this contributive outside world interactive experience where we are seeking, not just using it like we do with our driver, and not really we don't really pay attention to feedback on it because we're so overconfident with it. Mm-hmm. Because we're seeking feedback with these two, we're watching ourselves use it and then we're calibrating it through time. If somebody gives us bad feedback, we go, okay, I should do something about that. And the more we use it in contribution and the more we're trying to make them better, the more we're trying to develop a really strong, good relationship between those two parts, like a spinning coin. We can do that in the laboratory of life so much faster than we can just inside of ourselves in the axis of relating to self. In the axis relating to others, it gives us such fast feedback, such beautiful laboratory test iterate experiences that we can get to a point where we are truly serving other people with this beautiful simpatico of these two functions that we've learned how to work in conjunction with each other. And so then we watch ourselves contribute to others better and better and better. So it's not like I'm finding self-love because I'm improving my personality type. It's I'm finding self-love because I'm watching myself be this extraordinary contributor while working on my personality type. And it's all based on love, right? It's based on love of others. It's based on an increasing love of myself, an increasing appreciation of what I can bring to the world, a willingness to get that outer world feedback and do something with it. So it brings with it some humility, some modesty, as you mentioned before. And so that relationship right there, it helps us tap into something that then we can bring those lessons to our dominant and inferior or driver and 3-year-old and go, do you see that relationship that they've got over there? You can do that too. right? And now we start to not just grieve the limitation of our 3-year-old function or inferior. We start to find opportunities to integrate it into our driver or dominant. We start to find ways to turn that into a bit of a spinning coin itself. So now we're not just accepting that we have an inferior function and grieving it. We're now recognizing that if I don't give it too high of expectations and I'm not beating myself up over not meeting these things that I'm just never going to accomplish, I'm just never going to do that. If I can now see, no, but I can do other stuff. I can integrate it. I can make it part of my driver function, or almost like one thing, which is in Jung's terms called the transcendent function. We can turn it into something else, its own little thing, something totally different than what we've ever seen before. And now we really are a more optimized version of ourselves. Not the optimized version that we turned into a project and we're going to withhold love from ourselves until we got to that part. We are loving ourselves through the entire process. And so when we get to that place of an optimization, we didn't beat ourselves up to get there, which I don't actually think you can do sustainably. We loved ourselves to that place, and we loved other people to that place. And now we're just this like centered, confident, contributing, self-accepting, but at the same time, not letting ourselves off the hook person.
Yeah.
That is an authentic expression of self-love.
One thing that's coming up for me in that distinction you just made about a project and withholding love from ourselves, I was like, well, but rewards work. Like when I set up a reward system for myself, at least for me, it works. And so I think other personality types, and we can probably, as we get into the series, we can probably unpack which types are more rewarded by rewards. But I'm rewarded. Like I set a goal. I'm like, okay, if I achieve that goal, I'll give myself a reward. But the distinction I made is make sure that reward is not self-love. Like make sure it's not, well, I'll reward myself with love when I achieve X, Y, Z. And I'm very guilty of doing that in the past. It's, you love yourself no matter what because of who you are. You love your personality type for what it is. And then you can reward yourself for the things you're talking about, like balancing this or growing a part of myself. It's reward, and the reward can be tethered to something completely separate from love. It doesn't have to be love related. And I think that's the big takeaway or the distinction I'm making here is this reward, self-love kind of split and making those things very clear to be separate in my life.
Yeah. Yeah. We should never reward ourselves with things that you can't earn. And love isn't earned, right? Like love is grown. It's nurtured.
It's expressed.
It's
a verb, ultimately.
Yeah.
It's performed.
Now, again, just like a relationship will end if a person isn't earning other things like respect or, fair treatment, right? Like we earn, how do I say it? We earn sustainable relationship through improvement, and through the kinds of by meeting the expectation of the relationship, right? Like we earn. I'm trying to make sure that I don't say that we earn love, but it's like we earn Okay, that's what it is. We earn sustainable relationship through meeting the relationship's expectations. Yeah. So we can earn an extension of the relationship, but we don't earn love, right? Love is freely given. And usually when a relationship ends because we did not manage to earn sustainability, those two people don't just stop loving each other. They usually are very hurt by the experience. They go off. That's
why it's so hard.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
So love isn't like the love doesn't just end because the person didn't earn the relationship. The love stays. Yeah. And usually the person has to get some like distance from it in order and sometimes you die still loving the person, right? Like you never stopped loving them. You just couldn't be in relationship with them. So when it comes to ourselves, we don't earn self-love. We nurture it. We grow it. We express it. We find it. But we don't earn it. But we can earn self-respect. We can earn sustainability of relationship to self, like self-confidence and self-trust and all the things we talked about, the self-worth and all that. We can earn some of that, but we don't earn love. We have it. It's in there. And we have to actually find a way to express it to ourselves in a non-mutated form, really.
Well, what's coming up for me is love is on the control, or the mechanism of it is on the giving side, not the receiving side. In other words, if somebody says, well, I fell out of love with that person, what they're really saying is, because the person can't do anything to earn or not earn their love, what they're really saying is, I've decided to stop expressing love toward that energy of that person. Mm-hmm. That's what I have on my side have decided to do. It's on me, not on them. It's on me, because it can't be on them, because it was never about them in the first place. It was always me expressing it this direction. Mm-hmm. So same thing with myself. If I stop loving myself, is it because I'm unworthy, I don't deserve it? Or did I decide to stop loving myself? It's a decision by the giver, not the receiver. Right. And so me as the giver of love, and you listening right now, I think the takeaway for me, and hopefully for you too, is that you have to make the conscious effort to say, I am going to turn love into a verb. I'm going to express it. I'm going to make it a thing that I express and do and perform toward myself and for myself. That's really, I think that's really the takeaway that I'm coming from. Mm-hmm. So as you're listening along, what do you think? What's coming up for you in this conversation? Do you see this very similarly? Are you someone that expresses love to yourself? And we're talking about love to the self. That's kind of where it all ends up, but we're talking about loving your personality, right? We're talking about an access point. So as you think about who you are and how you're wired, the 4-letter code in the Myers-Briggs system, I guess you could look at your Enneagram too, or whatever, but also the cognitive functions in your 4-letter code from Myers-Briggs. Can you find a loving aspect of that? Like I have been at war recently with my 10-year-old extroverted thinking or effectiveness. It's been like this battle, right? We've got some pressure on us to make some things happen. And I'm like, why do I have to be limited in this way? And I'll often say I'll just mention some ENTJ in my life. Do they have to deal with this bull crap? Do they have to file this extra paper or do this extra stuff? Like, see, they have magical lives. Everything works out for them, right? And you talk to ENTJs and they're like, well, we have other things we deal with, right? But it's always like this idealism I have about who I should be with this part of myself. And sometimes I really go hard. I'm sure you listening to this too for yourself.
Yeah.
And I got to stop and say, no, I need to express that love regardless of this part of yourself, Joel. You're worthy and deserve love in your entire personality. All the parts of you that may not be the ones that you're super proud of. You wish they were better. You feel a little embarrassed or silly about that part of yourself. It deserves love too. Like, it deserves you to give it love, express love to it.
Oh yeah. And especially that 10-year-old part of us, that eternal child part. It's like, how successful is it as a parent to raise a child where you're withholding love until they perform in the way you want them to perform? It's like, that's created a bunch of jacked up kids in society, right?
Yeah, John Beebe says it's the business of children to be loved.
That's right.
And so that part of us, the business of that part of us is to sit there and accept the love from ourselves.
That's right. Yeah.
In a lot of ways.
Exactly. And so I think that's a fantastic point. And I mean, I've been beating myself up lately for being so emotionally out of, like I talked about, you and I had a tense moment and I felt this really strong emotion and I was like, you gave it to me. It was your emotion and I took it, right? My extroverted feeling like slurps it up. But then it feels like an emotion inside of me. Like I first of all, I can't blame you for that because I'm responsible for my emotional experience. But then I was like, it feels like gremlins get inside me. I feel like these emotions are inside me and the emotion is a gremlin that runs around just breaking things. And it takes so long to know how to process it and get it out of myself. And I've been really beating myself up over this. Like, why can't I have higher natural EQ for my own emotional experience? Why can't I do that? Why is it so hard? And it's because it is. Mm-hmm. And I just have to live with that. I just have to make peace. It's like, yeah, well, that's the straw you drew. So don't know what to tell you.
Yeah.
And if I can find acceptance for that and understand those limitations, but then at the same time, focus on the things about myself that are contributive based and truly steward my personality type, then it's like, okay, but I get all this other stuff. And I just don't get that, right? And so I think that's a fabulous point. It's like self-acceptance really means not beating up the fragile parts of who you are.
Yeah.
Right? The precious parts, the parts that need to be unconditionally loved.
So what's coming up for you? Come over to personalityhacker.com directly below this episode. I'd love to hear a comment. Maybe you could ask a question. If you have a story, I think stories are very powerful because they're compressed experiences. We can learn a lot about where you're coming from and your experience. Do you struggle with self-love? Is it something you've struggled with maybe recently, your whole life? Maybe you've overcome that. Maybe you do love yourself. You figured out avenues for that. And personality type was an on-ramp or an access point for that. We particularly want to look at how you and your personality have enabled more self-love in your life. Or maybe it's actually challenged your ability for self-love. Some people had good self-love and they found out who they were, like not who they were, but how their cognition was wired, their personality type. And they're like, oh, I don't know. I wish it was one of those cool types like ENFP. Everybody says that, of course.
I'm sure.
Come over to personalityhacker.com directly below this episode. Make your voice heard.
Yep. And I think we're going to do a series. That's what I suspect. I'm going to go ahead and lay an expectation.
We don't plan things. We're just perceivers, but you know.
But I think it would be good to go through
intentions.
All the personality types and talk about how we can use that little sort of algorithm.
You want to cluster them or do all 16? We'll figure that out.
We'll figure that out.
Yeah.
It might be a series of 8 more. It might be a series of 16. We'll
Factors
see.
of 2.
Yeah.
some type of factor of 2.
We'll see what happens. We don't know. We'll find out next week. So if you did enjoy this episode, you can subscribe to us on all sorts of podcasting platforms. There's too many to name now. If you leave us a rating review, particularly on iTunes, I read every one and I'm very grateful. And we haven't had one for a little bit and I don't think people are leaving them anymore. So if you
really does read every one of these.
I do.
Sometimes a lot.
Yeah.
Like over time, you'll go back and read them too.
Yeah. They're nourishment for my soul. They help keep me going. Because this podcast, I don't have an audience here. I don't know how people are receiving it. I don't know. Maybe people hate it. Who knows? But when somebody leaves a not just a rating, but also a review, then I go, okay, I'll keep going. So you should totally do that.
Or you have your assignment from Antonia.
That's right. And if self-love is a challenge, if it is a desire of yours to do as we're talking about, form a really good simpatico with who you are, using your personality type as an on-ramp to understand all these aspects of your life, I highly recommend the next time our Personality Life Path program opens up for registration, I highly recommend taking advantage of it. It is an absolutely fantastic program. It is designed to help you fall madly in love with your personality type and yourself, to look for all the opportunities and areas in your life to ameliorate your life so that it matches your type preferences, but then also not let yourself off the hook. Like look for ways that you can meet your own expectations, for your true inner self expectations that boost that self-confidence, that boosts that self-love. It's a fabulous program. So I highly recommend checking out more information about the Personality Life Path program at our website, personalityhacker.com.
Yeah, I second that. It's an incredible program. I stand behind it, and it changes lives. It really does. It changes our life too, every single time we run it. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast. Hey, it's Joel from Personality Hacker. So a big reason people get into personality types is usually to improve their relationships with other people. And you can understand key differences between you and someone else when you understand how type works. So clearly, personality type is applied to relationships. But what about the relationship with yourself? Well, personality type can also help you navigate your career, or maybe an educational path that you need to follow, or other opportunities that present themselves, and it helps you know which are the right choice for you. And ultimately, personality is the key to unlocking identity-level worldview and life purpose. It all starts with getting the owner's manual for your personality type. In this owner's manual, we cover the basics of your personality, and then we dive a layer deeper to connect your personality to your relationships, your career, your worldview, and identity, because we believe it's your life, and it should be designed for your personality. So start your owner's manual journey at personalityhacker.com. When you access your owner's manual, I recommend focusing on the ideal day exercise first, because when you start crafting your ideal day, you're being mindful about the type of lifestyle that you want. So designing a life around how you're naturally wired makes sense, and you can finally stop fighting yourself. So come discover and develop your unique personality at personalityhacker.com.